Hello, I'm David Wamsley. I've called this Should I Use Pixels, M's or REMs Page Builder Edition. I will be referring to Beaver Builder throughout this, but I think this may still be relevant to other page builders. The reason for this video is that it's been 2 years now since Beaver Builder released version 2.2, which added support for M's, REMs and viewport based units. And I've not covered this topic in 2 years and I've not seen much on it. There is some official documentation, and I think Beaver Builders will be similar to other page builders. They can let you know where these units are available within the page builder. There's some extra notes here on using viewport widths for font size. But when it comes to the issue of which unit to use, then I think all that page builders can wisely do is point you to articles where there are varying opinions on this. So perhaps less wisely, I thought I'd have a stab at adding a perspective. And the reason for that is that I think page builders are there to help non-coders mainly, so DIYers who want to make their own sites. And even if we're using them to build sites for clients, we hand them over to clients who may be confused by these extra options, even though I think most page builders probably default to pixels. Also, the reason for this is I've started to reconsider the units I'm using and my approach. It's part of my Beaver Junction project where I'm trying to speed up my workflow and be less dependent for styling on the page builders and do more with a style sheet and CSS. I'll show you where I've got to on that. I should quickly say that this is a contentious subject even amongst CSS experts, people who know far more than I do. So all I can do is offer perspective, my thoughts as a page builder user. Even if you find a good article out there that resonates with you, you probably need to check when that was published because things are changing all the time. More people, more visitors are using modern browsers that support new ways of managing units. I'm also going to cop out a little bit and say viewport widths for type for another time, partly because of the present browser support for it, but also I think I need to learn a little bit more, and I think it could be quite significant going forward. Let me quickly just sum up the units that are available. So we have pixels. I think everybody understands what that is. Certainly if you've needed to add images, you need to understand pixels. They are static, absolute lengths. What you see is what you get. Arguably, they're not as accessible. This is where the first contention comes in. And to explain that, I should say a user can change the settings in their browser to increase the default font size, which is usually 16 pixels for more readability. If that user then goes to your site and it's built with pixels, it's going to ignore their wishes and their settings that is in the browser. And this is where M's come in as a relative measure. They're more accessible. They will honor what somebody's put in their settings here. But it does have a downside that it suffers with some inheritance or compounding issues, which I'll show you in this video. And then later comes root M's, REMs. They are relative to the root of the document to the HTML element is usually where you set this. But the support isn't 100% as it is with the other two there. But I think it's getting there. The figure that I've given as I'm recording this video, of course, is from caniuse.com, and it's pretty much 99.5%. But I would actually say it's higher for using with typography in the way that I'm going to use this, so I'll show you that. So the support is almost there for that. As I mentioned, I'm going to skip over viewport widths, but effectively this is newer and it's relative to the browser size. So it needs some taming because once you've set something there, it's possible as you extend to a larger width there, the font's going to be unreadable at large size and at small size. So you might need to use media queries. I do think this is quite interesting. Just something I've discovered recently. There is a reference to it here about needing to calculate the sort of base of this relative unit here. But what I find interesting, if I just go over to Can I Use here, something I've discovered recently is an addition to the calculations that you can make, mathematical expressions of minimum, maximum, and clamp for the width of your unit. So if you're using this for typography, I mean, it's not just for that, it is possible now to set the minimum and the maximum that these units can go to for your typography. Of course, the support isn't fully there here. It's just over 90, not even quite 91% here. But interesting is clamp, I think, which kind of sets a midway point, a sort of maximum and minimum, something where it can only move within that area. So I think this could be really interesting for viewport widths going forward. But still, I don't think that's so relevant to what I'm talking about here, which is really about kind of setting up your documentation in the first place when you set up a site, which default unit you're going to use. I think still probably viewport widths, even though it's not fully supported, is something that's going to come in more for special effects, and it will take some time before we move into using it generally for setting our units in our documents. Okay, right, I went off a little bit there. So let me make the case for pixels. I've needed to make this case for myself. If I go back to when I really got into sensibly building sites for clients, I go really back to 2012. And back then, I wasn't using the page builder, I was using the Genesis framework, and they had adopted REMs there alongside pixels. So I was using a relative measure. But when I moved to Beaver Builder, pixels were all that were available to me. So I moved to that. So I needed this argument, and I've needed this for 6 years, and I think it still stands up. The reason for pixels is that, well, it's easy to understand. And if you're designing your pages or work with a designer, chances are they're going to be using static units. They might be working with something like Photoshop, and they might have some assets here that you want to add to your site. Well, it's just going to translate very easily. There's theme support for setting your text and heading. For most of the themes, they will support pixels if they've got that kind of support at all, so that makes it a lot easier. You know where you are, as I've mentioned. If you're using one of the relative units like REMs, I stumbled across this much earlier on, particularly with using WooCommerce. They said everything in REMs. I don't know the situation now. I haven't needed to edit something, but you'll get measurements like this, which is quite hard to read, and it's a measurement which is on REMs. You need to look to the parent to understand what that is. So it's quite tricky to work with. What a lot of people who will argue against the accessibility issues with pixels is the fact that browsers will take care of it. They already let us zoom. So if you are using pixels and you're not honoring the settings that somebody have put in their browser, well, that's okay. They can still zoom out and expand or make it smaller as they like. They just need to press Control and plus or minus and even scroll with that. So for me, I've not had an issue with using pixels or the accessibility. My key point really with this is that I feel we need to be pragmatic when it comes to accessibility. I absolutely think accessibility is really important. I've worked in the line of disability. I have friends of mine with disabilities that would exclude them from using the web, and it's really important to me that that doesn't. Everybody should be able to use the web. There's no doubt about that. But I think we have to be pragmatic about these things. So I've seen a recent article really taking to task the people who say, well, who actually puts these settings in their browser? Why don't you just use Zoom? And they would argue that they should measure it. And I think one article showed that it was probably, I think, according to some Google research on that, it was about 0.3% of people had changed their font settings in their browser. So we're talking about maybe 3 in 1,000, but even if it's 1 in 100, there still is the ability in accessibility to still zoom. That is still available to you. And I think everybody's got a budget when it comes to accessibility. Certainly my clients have. So I would say the people that I've worked with who have put accessibility as one of their key things because they're providing some kind of public service have ended up with websites which have probably been the least accessible in my opinion, because they maybe have a lot of material as well, which is audio, which hasn't been transcribed, or videos that people just can't access that content. And there are even maybe silly things that people don't look at. There's certainly one site that I know where accessibility was a big concern. I've looked at their site again, and they've redesigned it. And I find it very difficult to actually read the fonts there because of the colors that are picked. And I just wonder, there is something, and this is a Western figure, where color blindness amongst men in the West at least is estimated to be something like 8%, about 0.5% for women of some form of color blindness. So I wondered whether many of these sites spend time looking at the different types of color blindness and check whether they're making their sites accessible that way. So that's my key point. I'm going off on one a little bit here, but I just think it has to be set in context according to, we have to be pragmatic according to the budgets. What I think when it comes to pixels, because of zooming on browsers, I don't think it excludes anybody. So if it's much easier to build a site using pixels, you can save money there that you can put into helping on other accessibility. You could argue the other way, that using pixels is more accessible. It allows you to put your budget into other things. That's kind of my argument here. Now let me switch to the other side of this one, because there's no denying that for accessibility, if somebody has put their settings in their browser, we should be trying to honor it on building our site. So, you know, there's no getting away from that. And even if it's small numbers now, if more people were building with relative units, perhaps more people would set up their browsers that way. There is also fairly good support for a lot of themes for setting your typography through the customizer in WordPress themes, but it's not there in many of them, not like it is with pixels. Flexibility becomes the issue here, and I really understand the people who will argue for the relative units, because it does kind of make sense. I think at the root of maybe these arguments, or maybe I'm misunderstanding it, but I think it is the fact that if you were building the web today, would you really have at the center of it a static unit, given all we know about the medium and the different devices that need to access the web? It kind of makes sense that we'd be working to relative units, really, doesn't it? So I can understand the frustration of the relative unit people with the against the kind of pixels. It kind of makes sense to me. So I can see that element as well. I should mention that with using EMS, you don't have to pick with relative. You can mix it up a little bit. You can use EMS, if you like, at a more modular level and set pixels when you're setting up your basic site. Of course, that's not going to help with accessibility, but it still is a unit that you can use even if accessibility isn't your concern there. Let me move on to REMs, which is what I'm more interested in now. The browser support is growing for it. Now, mostly it's the same benefits as EMS here, but it reduces this compounding inheritance issue. So perhaps what I should just do is show you what that is. So I think I stole the example from an article, but I can't remember what that was. I just remembered it. And here it is. So here's the issue with EMS. So what I've got here is a HTML module. What I've done is within a div, I've put a paragraph here, and then outside that paragraph, but within the div, I've also put this anchor tag over here. And if we go and look over where I've put the CSS, which is here, I've set this to a fixed 20 pixels, just so it's easy to understand for the div. And we are using a relative measure here of EMS, of course. So that's pretty easy to understand, isn't it? So what we're saying here is the paragraph is going to be 1.5 times the size of its parents. That's how the EMS work. So this is going to be 30 pixels. And we've done exactly the same with the anchor tag. Again, 30 pixels. We can understand that. That's true. Here's where it gets a little bit tricky because of the kind of inheritance. Let me just go over here. Now, if I take this anchor tag and add it within the paragraph, what's happening is that it's inheriting the 1.5 that we've got for the div, but also the one that's assigned to the paragraph as well. So it's much bigger than perhaps you would naturally expect it to be in the way that you've marked it up. So this is where it can get really confusing, where you've got lots of nested elements and you can easily trip over things or lose what you're looking at. So that really is the issue. Let me just go back to here. And why REMs solve that is that we can actually kind of set this kind of magic number, this percent here, and have REMs equal pixels quite easy to understand them. And that's really how I've been using them on my project. So let me go over to something I'm working on with my Beaver Junction project. That doesn't mean anything. It's over at beaverjunction.com. You'll probably be able to work out. It's a series of templates. But I'm also trying to work on some wireframes where these templates can be added to this wireframe. And I'm spending some time now trying to work out how to set this up so I can make any kind of site. So I've just moved to using REMs here, and I can just show you how I think these are quite useful if you want to work with the CSS. Let me just go over to my style sheet, which is contained within the page builder itself here. So what I've done here is I've set at the root this 62.5% here, which means that everything else I put here, so the font size for the body here, so all my regular text, is being set effectively to 16 pixels by default. And then I've done exactly the same here with my headers here. I can read those so much more easily. I can see that this is going to be 36 pixels, 30 pixels, 24 pixels, and all the line heights are set without units here, so you can add a unit if you like, but it means that it's just going to inherit the unit that goes with the font itself. So I could change everything by just changing the numbers here if I want to make things bigger and smaller. And in fact, what I've done in this case is, you may have even spotted it if I just sort of scroll down here, that even on this video recording you might see that the font size looks a little bit bigger than 16. And what I've done, actually, I've set this here with a kind of mobile first approach. So here I've got it all at 16, but in fact if I go down to my responsive settings here, what I've done is I've set at the minimum width of 992 pixels the font size at 72%. So what I'm actually doing, the size that we are viewing it at the moment, which is over 992 pixels, I've actually increased the font size over here to 72. So I actually don't know. I need to do some calculation to find out what the font size is. It's going to be somewhere between, I think, 18 and 19 pixels. But I've just been able to change this relative for the whole of the document. And I can kind of just show you the extremes we can easily go to. If I set this to 0 here, you can see I've just removed all of the text, or well, I've hidden it from view here. Let me just go back to what it was, to 72. And what I'm going to do as well is to just go and press R. Whoops, I'll get out of this. Just press R a couple of times so we can get to the mobile view. And as you can see, everything has reduced down in size from what we had it at the full size. So I think it's really handy for just kind of setting up once and being able to adjust. So if I'm working with a client on this template that I've created, in an earlier video I showed how I could just change the basic color styles. Here I can kind of adjust if the client looks at it and thinks the typography is a little bit too big, I can just reduce it down and move it up with just a few changes, because everything is relative. So that's the way I'm moving forward, a little bit to REMs these days. Let me just sum up what I've been talking about in this video. So what I think is that really what units to use is really the debate about whether you should use fixed or relative units and which is best for the web. I think pixels are more accessible to non-coders and it makes it easier to kind of work with. I don't think there are huge issues in terms of accessibility, and there may be things that you want to spend more time on when it comes to that. REMs, though, is, I think, interesting now there is greater support for it, and you can kind of easily equate it with pixels. I think it gives you a lot more flexibility. That the way I'm planning to use it will mean that it's going to be a lot quicker than it will be me working with pixels, where if I want to set my responsive settings, I'm going to go in and need to set each of those individually. Anyway, I think that's all I need to say on this. I'll just put this over to you now. Is there anything that I've missed? Is there anything that I didn't explain very well? And if you did like this video, then please give me a thumbs up on YouTube and consider subscribing to the channel. And I hope to see you again in another video. Thanks so much for your time. Bye-bye.